Hello and welcome back to the Prospect Podcast. I'm Ellen Halliday,
And I'm Alona Ferber.
and today we're talking about whether what's happening in America could happen here and looking ahead to the local elections taking place in parts of England next week. For this, we're joined again by our contributing editor, Philip Collins, who's been digging into the populist right's plans for us here at Prospect. Welcome, Phil, to the podcast.
Thank you. It's very nice to be here.
You've been working on this piece for us, as you say, doing the work so that our prospect listeners at home don't have to try and kind of figure out what the populist right in the UK would do if it were to kind of be in that seat of power, as indeed the populist right now is in America. And we kind of asked you to look into that because obviously what's happening in America is transforming the nation's democracy, transforming the country in a really huge way. And we wanted to find out if Britain was kind of if there was such a plan for, such actions here in the UK, and if British democracy was therefore kind of resilient to withstand that. Can you tell us a bit about what you found? I know this is really fresh in your mind at the moment. So, yeah, it would be great to hear how well formed is that plan and how resilient is British democracy to a populist right wing government that wanted to really change British democracy?
Well, I don't think there's a plan as such. I don't think that hiding somewhere in the SW1 area is a locked drawer with a plan inside it. So I don't think it's advanced in that sense. But I think it's more a question of working out the instincts of the people involved and what they would do to cement their power. Now, I think generally, the British electoral system is the best barrier against this kind of thing because it's tended to give exaggerated victories to the main parties. But as I said before, politics are splintered four ways, and so that barrier has been lowered very substantially. So it's not inconceivable that you could get a tipping point and a lot of Reform MPs. So I've kind of gone with the thought experiment that if Reform can get over the barrier of the electoral system and get to a point where perhaps in coalition with a rather desperate Conservative Party, and that's a very important consideration, it turns out, perhaps some combination of those, with if Farage could be the lead, could then lead to a populist kind of government. And the more I looked at it, the more I thought actually the danger lies with the Conservative Party too. That the last 10 years have been a sort of stress test of the unwritten British Constitution. All sorts of offences, really, against constitutional norms. The most obvious of which was Boris Johnson's prorogation of Parliament, attempted, that was deemed unlawful by the Supreme Court. And what you realise, it's something that there's a very good book of How Democracies End, Daniel Ziblatt and Stephen Levitsky, all about America, but they make the very important point, which applies even more to Britain, which is that constitutional norms are actually about tacit understandings. They're not principally about what's written down. That's an appeal in the last resort. But just as the law is, in fact, more about compliance and is about enforcement, if nobody complied with the law, there'd be no possibility of enforcing it. So that's true of politics as well. And if you have people who are determined not to comply with standard political and democratic norms, it's very difficult to enforce them, in fact, and the more so in an unwritten constitution. So I think if you get people who simply don't respect the norms, then I think you've got a problem. And I think it's reasonable to postulate that Farage would be one of those people, because his whole shtick, his whole appeal is that I, the populist leader, am the tribune of the people. I know the truth that you feel, which the elite is consciously and deliberately blocking. And that's the standard appeal of the populist, and that's exactly what Farage has in common with Trump, is what he has in common with people who are more egregious than him, the likes of Orban or Erdogan, or in some ways Narendra Modi in India. These examples are all extremely different, and I'm not saying we can simply read across, but they all share that analysis, which is that I, the leader, have a a natural channel to the real will of the people that doesn't have to go through these procedures. I think Boris Johnson had some of that too, and it's a sort of arrogance. And if you postulate that Farage has that, therefore you can redescribe breaking constitutional norms as actually doing something more democratic. Because the people think this, therefore I'm following their will. And this pettifogging rule and regulation is getting in the way of the real popular will. And I think Farage has that tendency. So I think it's the tendency and the disposition rather than a plan. But I think that's entirely possible that you'd find things like the prorogation of Parliament, or another example would have been Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng just summarily sacking the permanent secretary at the Treasury with no process. I think there've been quite a lot of, I think the complete disregard for truth of the Rwanda bill. I think there've been a number of examples over the past decade where the Conservative Party have laid the ground constitutionally for someone who wanted to simply come in and attack the judiciary, attack the civil service, attack independent institutions, because that's where the real risk lies. And I think it's a meaningful risk.
And where do you see Kemi Badenoch kind of in that, or Robert Jenrick, who, looks like he's maybe the person likely to challenge her for leadership? Do you think that there's who the people who are currently kind of leading the Conservative Party, would they be following Farage in that direction?
It's a very good question, and I wish I had a better answer because it's not clear yet. It's very important, though, that the leader of the Conservative Party were to say, "We will on no account deal with Farage." If the leader of the of the Conservative Party were in that position, then this conversation would be very different, because it really is a very long way from 5 Reform MPs to 325 and an overall majority. But it's not that far, in fact, 290, which is a candidate for power in concert with the Conservative Party. So the attitude of the leader of the Conservative Party is critical. And we don't really know the answer to that question yet. I think Kemi Badenoch has been largely silent on this, as indeed on almost everything else. I don't think that can last. There's a strong fight within the Conservative Party between those people who on no account want anything to do with Farage, who think the future of the Tory party is to reclaim the sort of political centre, and when the Labour government falls over, as all governments do, to be ready in place to compete for those votes that have gone back to Labour this time. But there's a very strong element, because Brexit put sort of the toxins into the system to the Tory party. I think Brexit was, George Dangerfield said of the 1906 landslide, it was a victory from which the Liberal Party never recovered. I think that this is true of Brexit for the Tory party. It's a victory from which they may never recover. And the other side, the Conservative Party, thinks that the future for them is, in fact, to move to a kind of populist right position. And I think Robert Jenrick will be the voice of that. So if Jenrick were to challenge Kemi Badenoch and were to win, then I think the likelihood of a connection between the Tories and Reform goes up. And then we enter a danger point, because that's the point at which that bloc becomes a candidate for government. And I think, and there's one other person I'd like to mention in this regard, because we've got lots of former prime ministers to choose from as the villain of the piece. There are two currently in play. One of whom, Liz Truss, is currently in conversations, we're led to believe, with Nigel Farage
Mm.
about whether she has some sort of role to play in the future. If I were Farage, I'd be very, very wary of that. I'm not sure that Trump and Truss are a great advertising pair for him. But the other former Prime Minister, who I do think is licking his wounds somewhere in Oxfordshire, looking for a way back into politics, is Boris Johnson. Now, it's not inconceivable to imagine a Tory party in its desperation, perhaps after another election defeat, thinking, we've only had one popular leader in the last 15 years. It wasn't all that bad, all that stuff we've forgotten about. I can't remember why he had to resign, probably, but let's go back there. And now I know Johnson thinks this is possible. I think it's all unlikely. I think everything we're talking about is still at the outer edges of likely. I think the most likely outcome is actually a second term for the Labour Party. But it's not inconceivable. And if you did get that, if in the future Boris Johnson were to find his way back, I don't think Johnson has any restraints constitutionally. I don't think he would regard, as we've seen before, the democratic procedures as a constraint on what he wanted to do. So at that point, an alliance between those two, so self-regarding populists, would be the most acute danger point.
Phil, you, of course, were a speechwriter for Labour. You've thought a lot about the way Labour should kind of um, sell its message to the British public over the years. And so, what do we know about how Labour is assessing these potential scenarios, these risks, these strategies, and what's it doing to kind of counter the possibility of a strong populist right force?
Well, it's very worried about it for a start. It's certainly very concerned about the threat of reform, as indeed they should be. So I think the first thought is they're taking it very seriously, and that's good because there's been a tendency to underestimate the effect of Farage on British politics for a long time. However, I don't think they're yet entirely sure what to do about it. Now, one strand of response would be to go back to what is known in the trade and within the Labour Party as Blue Labour, which is to say to reconnect with what the conservative tradition in the Labour Party, small c conservative. And there's a lot to be said about the conservative tradition in the Labour Party. I mean, I think all of Labour's prime ministers, successful ones, Attlee, Wilson, Blair, Starmer, all had a trace of conservatism in them. I think the electorate can see that. So I think, and that's about connecting back to where people are. I think, but my own view of that Blue Labour is that it tends, when you get to thinking about what you should do, it tends to a sort of nostalgia about turning the clock back and a return. So I'm not sure that it leads you anywhere. It's fine with diagnosis to say that globalization has left behind serious losers, and we need to address that fact. Well, fine, but now what do we do about it? That's much, much harder. But the answer has to lie, I think, in action. The great privilege that government gives you is you can set the frame by acting. So British Steel is a good case in point. Whether or not you agree with the outcome they're going to land up with, I thought that they moved decisively and emphatically and with clarity. And that's the sort of thing you need to do over and over again. And so that's what I'd be arguing. I'd be arguing for a recognition that in lots of places in England, the towns of England, they have not really benefited from the burst of energy that happened in the 2000s in the cities. That's definitely true. It's not for lack of trying. There's been all sorts of government attempts to make those places grow again. It thus far hasn't worked. So there's a recognition of that. And then a series of policies to try and improve things. Because in the end, all you can offer is we are offering you real benefits here. This government is bringing waiting times down. It is making it easier to see a GP. It's improving the schools. We've got a skills program that your kids might benefit from. These, in the end, are the things that underlie, I think, the populist surge everywhere. So I think that's what I would do. I would try and go to its roots and to act on it. And it's a long cause. You can't claim success quickly, but that's the best argument you've got. By the time of the election, if you can say it's been tough, we had a very tough inheritance, but the NHS is going in the right direction, schools going in the right direction, belatedly the economy is moving, I think that's still your best. The conventional route is still your best one, because underlying all this, the grand narrative of the piece I've written, in fact, I went back to the literature on the decline of democracy, of which there are the sort of cottage industry now. And it's fascinating material, but one common theme is that it's a very strong theme you featured many, many times, which is the fact that the average worker hasn't had a pay rise for a very long time. The bargain, once upon a time, was that democracy will give you, on the one hand, agency and a sense of representation, but on the second, material benefits. Life will improve. Your life will get better. Your children's life will be better than yours. And that bargain is quite clearly broken down. And so trying to do something about that bargain, I think, is the ultimate answer.
Yeah. Is there, in terms of the style of communication, something that Labour could learn from Reform? We talk about sometimes these kind of populist right-wing parties doing well on better on social media, being more, maybe appearing more authentic, appearing to speak more directly to people. Do you think that's true? And should
Well,
Labour set itself apart or maybe mimic that a bit?
I mean, yes and no. It is true. We have to think, why is it true? It's true because Farage is not really pitching to be Prime Minister yet. Now, if you're pitching to win 40% of the electorate, you have to temper what you say. If I wanted to just appeal to 10% of people who are listening, I could say something probably quite outrageous on one side or the other, and 10% would nod along and say, absolutely right, and I'd lose all the others. Whereas if I wanted to appeal to 50% of people listening, I'd have to be a bit more measured. So I try and win over the 10% who agree with the extreme version of that case, but I also try and keep others on side. So if you're trying to win in a democracy, you're always doing that. There's a tendency to be gentler. Whereas Farage can be really candid about things up to the point he's only seeking to win 25%. So it's partly that's the populist prerogative to do that. Partly is what he's like. I mean, he is the anti-politician, and it looks right with him. If Keir Starmer tried that it simply wouldn't work. So I think there's also the factor: who have you got? Who can genuinely do that kind of thing, and who can't? Keir Starmer simply can't do that. It would look ridiculous. And I've done some writing for Keir in the past when he was leader of the opposition, and my advice then, which was what we tried to do, is to make the very most of the virtues he has, which are to do with solidity and decency and respectability and forensic approach to detail, etc.
Phil, well, it's been a pleasure to have you on the podcast. And between now and well, your piece will be out, so listeners can read more in full about exactly what you found out about Reform's long-term planning. That'll be out on the 7th of May, I think, with our new issue. So yeah, if people want to find out more, they can go away and read that. But thank you so much for talking us through a little bit on that this morning. This interview was from an episode of the Prospect podcast. To listen to the episode in full, including further discussion and our weekly banger and dud section, click the link in the description below. And to read more of Prospect's award-winning journalism, head to prospectmagazine.co.uk.